Welcome. Today's guest is Dr. Patrick Bury, a Senior Associate Professor in Security at the University of Bath. He specialises in warfare and counter-terrorism. He's also a former British Army captain and NATO analyst, and we discuss the current situation in Iran with implications for America, Israel, and as well China and Russia. What are the aims of the current operation? Trump actually mentioned on his Truth Social last week about unconditional surrender. Are the US pushing for full regime change here, and Israel as well? What do you think the actual strategic aims are right now?
So I think there's a couple of things to note about what the US and Israel's strategic aims may be. I think you've got to see this in the context. People are saying this is chaotic. The aims have changed, and that's probably going to the root of your question. And there's been a lack of clarity. And so basically what we saw was the US saying, first of all, it was regime change, and obviously then mixed in with a bit of the nuclear element and the nuclear threat. And then in a few days later, it became about destroying stockpiles of ballistic missiles and the Iranian Navy as well. So those aims aren't all mutually exclusive. You know, you can have them. It's just the chaotic manner in which it was articulated to the general public. And I think, you know, I don't know if anyone's listened to the New York Times in January, got in and got to speak to Trump for about an hour and a half or something. And what became clear listening to the podcast of those guys is it's a chaotic White House. It's run off WhatsApp generally, and there's a lot of little fiefdoms, etc. like that. So it's quite chaotic. So to kind of understand that this is actually a reflection of how the White House is working, and that getting it in sort of drip fed like that, it took really Marco Rubio to come out and kind of put a bit of coherence on the whole thing when he did so. So I think in terms of the aims, you know, I think regime change is less likely now. I think their most optimistic aim was that in the decapitation of this window of opportunity, target of opportunity that the Israelis and the Americans had when they worked out that most of the leadership was going to be in this place, and the senior leadership, Khamenei, etc., was located in his compound, and they decided to take those strikes. I think their best case scenario was that then there would be another uprising, for example, or someone within who was more moderate, and actually Khamenei was seen as quite moderate compared to the IRGC. Some of them might come to the fore. But I mean, looking at this, you know, in terms of someone who kind of looks at security, and the moment for regime change was back in late December, early January. And the problem then was the Israelis weren't ready and the US wasn't ready. But this is the nature of military, you know, situation changing. At the time when the moment is there, you're only half cocked and you're not ready to go. So you delay it a couple of months, and then the conditions are not right. And if you're thinking about, is regime change possible? Well, it's not really, because the biggest indicator here is when Khamenei is announced to being killed, there's no protests on the street. There's a lot of people cheering. We understand that the Iranians are deeply divided about this, but nothing is going to manifest itself, because guess what? They've killed, you know, 12,000 people. Your brothers and your sisters are in the ground, and you're going to go and protest again. It's too soon. It may happen down the line when the regime are further degraded, like we saw with Milosevic, but it's not going to happen in the short term. And the risk of these strikes, and the way that they're in the last, you know, 36 hours expanding them to the oil depots, etc., makes you wonder, is it pushing the dial of normal Iranians further towards resistance to America, for example, in Israel? But we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive that the strikes are coming, like you said, maybe 2 months after 30,000 of the protesters were actually killed by the Iranian regime. So it just seems a bit delayed, obviously. And because of that, you might not have a popular uprising, which we might actually get to. Let's just outline first, perhaps, why now? So there's different theories of this. Like some people say it might be that Israel is actually pushing Trump to do this. Some people say, obviously, it's about a nuclear weapon. Perhaps it's a show of strength to China. So where do you stand on why now? Like, why this specific moment?
From my reading of it, I think that we know, you know, what's come out, what's really interesting is kind of the half-life of secrets now. It's just, there's so much transparency. People leak things so quickly. We know way more about the elements of the intelligence picture behind this, you know, decision to do so. So first of all, the Iranians had been mapping pattern of life in Tehran by hacking the traffic cameras, essentially. And from that, they used bodyguards. They focused in on the bodyguards, who would obviously have to run on a fairly normal schedule, log in, log out, etc., using their pattern of life to understand where senior figures in the regime who had these bodyguards may or may not be. It looks like there was some piece of exquisite intelligence, probably human intelligence, which came from then the CIA. Now, the CIA fed that to the Israelis. The person who did that is really quite interesting, because imagine taking the decision to say, I feed this to the Israelis. Maybe you didn't know the significance of it all, but given the current context of what had happened, the CIA people are very clever. You're probably aware of what some of the consequences could be. So that's a very interesting decision taken there. I think the Israelis then put those two pieces together, realised they had an opportunity here to take out the leader, and this fit with their long-term strategic aims, which is under Netanyahu, we cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. The regime is despotic, the people are against it, it's never been weaker, and we have an opportunity to take out the senior leadership. I think the Israelis then said, we're going, which left, and this is as per Rubio, which left the Americans in a conundrum. There's a couple of different things here. If the Israelis went on their own and said, we may have to use nuclear weapons if this doesn't go right with us, the Americans would have an extra incentive to go in there because they've got their greater conventional firepower. And the other one that Rubio spoke about was that if the Israelis go in first, the assessment was by the US that they would be targeted, their bases would be targeted by the Iranians anyway, whether they went in or not. Can't speak to the veracity of that. So I think we had a wider strategic context within which Iran is seen as weaker, hadn't responded very strongly in the way that it could have in June, and then this target of opportunity. And the hope that something would happen inside Iran. And that's my reading of what we know so far, and the decision-making calculus as well. I mean, there's other things, it does need to be mentioned, Epstein files, distraction. These are moving from low plausibility outcomes to medium plausibility. So keep an eye on that. And if you look at the interest in the Epstein files as a result of this is dropped heavily. So.
That's an interesting point. Do you actually think the Israelis might have said that, look, if we can't achieve this with our conventional air power, we might actually have to use a tactical nuke? And do you think that might have put pressure on the Americans?
It's really difficult. I don't know. But if you think about it, it becomes more likely if it's just Israel versus Iran and the Americans are standing by. So who knows? But it does seem like pretty much, if you look at the way this, obviously the build-up was happening. The negotiations were happening, and there seemed to be, according to the Omanis and the Iranians, some progress on this. The problem was on the nuclear issue, but Trump had widened it and said, listen, the nuclear deal on its own can't be dealt with, because the ballistics and the drone threat is basically your umbrella to further develop. So we have to talk about them in that context. And the Iranians were like, no, that's not on the table. I mean, so that's the other really important context here as well. I think, and as you mentioned, strategically, if you look at I think China gets about 15% of its oil from Iran. It's a major purchaser in terms of sanctions busting from Iran. Is an element of strategy to that. When you're doing your lists of pros and cons of why to do this, that would definitely be one. But it all depends on how it goes. And now they're bombing the oil infrastructure, as it were, as I think counter-value, strikes in terms of managing escalation. So, but that has the ability, of course, of Iran to sustain a long fight. But also what happens if there is post-regime, you've basically kind of starting to destroy the national infrastructure that you need to sustain any more friendly regime afterwards.
What can be achieved in terms of air power? So obviously, without putting boots on the ground, can you actually get to the stage where you destroy all potential for nuclear armament in Iran? And can you also degrade their military to the point where they can't fight back anymore? Can you achieve that from the air?
So if you're looking at the nuclear facilities, it looks like some of this is buried so deep now that you would need to either use incredibly heavy and numerous, sort of the mother of all Moab bombs, I can't remember the exact GBU something, 15s maybe. You need to use those, of which the Americans only have them. Obviously you can use multiple repeated strikes, but it looks like the assessment is you either use something incredibly explosive, and then that's again where you come back to potentially a nuclear weapon, or you get boots on the ground like a raid but with huge amounts of explosives and try to basically, although you can't get that deep, you basically cover it. That's my understanding from what we know. I think what's more likely, in the scenario. So that's one sort of. Let's talk about tactical operational problem. The other one is how does this affect the regime's ability to stay in power? And we've seen, the rates of ballistic missiles, etc., drop off sharply, which indicates they're targeting the launchers and also of the drones. I think where and we also know from history, air power cannot on its own usually, well almost always bring about regime change. But what we do know is US air power with the Northern Alliance and CIA and special forces very quickly toppled the Taliban. Different kind of regime. NATO air power, along with the rising in the east in Benghazi, fairly quickly once it was unleashed, toppled Gaddafi. NATO air power and then political change a year later toppled Slobodan Milosevic. So there are situations where it can help. But for me, what I think, the really interesting thing will be what happens. Obviously, we're dealing with like phase 1-ish here, kind of moving into phase 2. They've suppressed the enemy air defences. They've taken out a lot of launches. They've taken out some of the regime. They're moving for command and control and radars, etc. Can they start to flood? And Iran is a huge country. Get the sort of persistent drone coverage in there, which puts a bubble over the areas, and then you link up those bubbles. And if those drones can stay, and you can imagine with AI targeting, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance suite that goes into that, they can start to then really get much more of a pattern of life and a much more granular picture. And if they can sustain that, well, then it becomes much more difficult for the Iranian forces to move in certain areas. So I think that's really very interesting to see if they end up with a persistent cover over parts of Iran and then start to expand that out. And that is the technological difference, shall we say, between previous examples of air power, because you're talking about persistent drone coverage over large swathes, and then it becomes much more difficult, as I'm saying, like to even move drones around which potentially have trucks, because you're able to track them being moved, etc., and with AI and patterns of life. So we'll see. That's like one, I'd say, qualitative difference.
Very interesting. So do you think there's a possibility that like Israel and the US can destroy the ideology at the center of this and put a gulf between the Revolutionary Guard and the people of Iran? Or do you think that perhaps it might actually consolidate Iranian support around the regime?
That's a good question. What you need to remember, there's two really important indicators here, which is, first of all, there is no structured opposition in Iran. It's been wiped out. Yeah. And there hasn't been for years. And secondly, as of the start of this war, the military had a complete monopoly of violence. So this separates it from the Afghan example I spoke about and the Libyan example. Yeah, there is no access to weapons for people. They don't have guns or rockets or mortars or anything like that. And the only way they'll get them is if military bases are overrun, yeah, and seized full, of stock. And then they start to organise themselves. So at the moment, I think, and again, after the suppression of the last uprising, I think that's unlikely. We can talk, and are you ideologically going to defeat this enemy anyway? There's always going to be a remnant, isn't there? There's always going to be a remnant. They're part of Iranian society, It's just whether they're in the ascendancy or not. And secondly, then, of course, it's about this Kurdish question, which the US seem to be humming and hawing about, and whether the Kurds up in the northwest, it's a small area of Iran, really, could be enticed to come down. But I think that, raises numerous, as many questions as it answers, in terms of like, well, how are the normal Iranians going to respond to a Kurdish, essentially a Kurdish invasion? And what are their goals? What are the Kurds' goals? Like they don't really want to take the Tehran and the whole of the country, and could they? I doubt it. And they'd need massive amounts of air support as well. So I see that more like potentially as an operational influx, to kind of fix Iranian forces and open a new front, rather than potentially take the whole country. It's very complicated regional dynamics of what happens if that happens, in terms of affecting Turkey, affecting Israel, the Azeris, so.
Why would the Kurds actually be motivated to do that? And I assume the US doesn't think that the Kurds could actually replace the government and form some kind of interim government. So what are they just acting? Could they be acting as proxy troops on the ground instead of putting US troops on the ground and carrying?
Well, if you think about how fast the Syrian government actually fell, once you got to a point where this is a bit of a paper tiger and the Islamists just swept through with the help of the Turks, that's your kind of view. Again, look at the Taliban fall in 2001. Just quickly it reached critical mass. You got a lot of firepower, and then you just walk in now and restore some sort of order, light order, and then there's a political facilitation thing. I mean, the Kurds would be enticed because they get some of their, what they view as their homeland back, as I mentioned, which is a relatively small part of northwest Iran. But, you know, they've been bitten before, haven't they? They've risen up before, you know, I think it's, 91 against Saddam, for example. They've been let down previously by the US, so who knows what there's some reports coming out that they're kind of ready to go, but they're not equipped. You know, they've only got Kalashnikovs. They don't have any heavy weapons or anything like that. So I think they're usually, the Kurds, high on motivation. They're only seen as reliable ground forces. But whether they're whether they're ready for this is another matter entirely. And they're going to be cautious given the kind of weapons that the regime have in Iran as well. They don't want to go into a sort of suicide mission.
How long do you think the Iranian regime can actually continue to fire back? Is it possible to actually know that right now? Like, how long can they keep attacking the Gulf? And as well, can they actually call in proxies? The Houthis haven't got involved majorly yet, and Hezbollah has a little bit. So what are we talking about there over the next few weeks?
So I think what we've seen is basically, so say the first day of the war, the Iranians launched about 375 ballistic missiles and about 300 drones. And the next day they launched about 175 missiles and 500 drones. But since then, right, it's been dropping at a rate of attrition of dropping off about 50% a day. And as of last night, it was like 16 ballistics and 110 drones or something. Now, the drones, of course, you know, lower impact, less damage, but kind of very useful. And we can talk about some of their targeting, what they seem to achieve with their drones. But so it's very difficult to put an estimate on how long the regime can last, because that involves the whole thing in terms of like wider than just the ballistics. But their impact on the region is decreasing, and the Gulf states clearly have enough, although they would have, say, under the sustained barrage of the first couple of days, that would have reduced their stockpiles really quickly. I mean, they're easily going to be able to sustain this with what they have, you know, the number of missiles they have, I think. Some people have said, oh, well, maybe the Iranians are using the kind of this initial barrage to wear down the stockpiles, and then they're going to fire more later. Well, I mean, that's much more difficult, as I've said to you. Like, once you get the persistent ISR coverage, taking out the TEL launchers, and you're an Iranian commander who's basically got no command and control anyway, because that's what they've done. They've distributed decentralized command. Are you going to hang around with your launchers waiting to be hit? No, you're going to fire and probably get out of there. So I think that's less credible now. I don't think we're going to see a sort of heavy second barrage, but let's see. On the proxies, yeah, I mean, again, it comes down to, if you're the Houthis and you're sitting in Yemen, you know, and you're reliant on Iranian resupply and sometimes intel, and they're getting hammered. Like, your comms to them have probably dropped off, first of all. Your supply, your chance of resupply, very limited. And is it in your interests to just start off, to kick off, like, you know, if as requested? I mean, Hezbollah is a slightly different situation as far as I understand. You know, I was listening to an expert from the Lebanon, a professor, and he was just saying, you know, you don't understand that while it looks like kind of suicide mission for Hezbollah to kick off against Israel, what the clerics tell them to do, that's their religious leader. You know, this is a religious instruction, and you don't in the Shia faith, you know, you don't ignore that. So that's the difference with the Shia Hezbollah, as far as I understand. I mean, the other interesting angle that's emerged from this is and you know, it does tie into the drones and ballistics pieces, the targeting help that the Iranians are getting from the Russians. And so, from my understanding, there's at least, so we've got the most exquisite and high-end interceptor package that in the world is called the THAAD, which is the high altitude, very expensive missile, but best at taking out, you know, even has a good chance against the hypersonics. The Patriot does too, potentially better. But the radars, from at least, we think there was about 4 of those systems in the Middle East, of only 8 globally, which the US has. It looks like, you know, from open source, at least 3 of those systems have been severely damaged by, you know, those systems cost $1 billion. The radars are the main part to them. And the radar part have been damaged by or destroyed by Shahed drones, which cost, you know, $35,000-ish at the moment. And that creates a situation where the warning times for, say, Israel and the Gulf are reduced significantly. So people are saying in Israel, the air raid sirens going off now are only giving us 2 to 3 minutes warning when they used to get 10, etc. So that's a very interesting thing to watch, and it does suggest, again, some of these strikes on the hotels, as far as I understand, it looks kind of random, hitting civilian architecture. It's not actually. They've got intel where US officials stay in hotels, and that's what they're going for. Again, you've seen it with the embassies, the consulates, etc. So there's a lot of targeting help. And of course, the Russians will just say, well, you're doing the same with the Ukrainians.
Has this completely remodeled the relationships between states in the Middle East? So obviously the Gulf states, which are a little bit more moderate, you could say, compared to Iran at least, they're starting to refer to Iran now as the enemy. So the rhetoric has changed. So are we going to see like a remodeled Middle East with the Gulf states and Israel, maybe in contrast with Iran, which is obviously more extreme?
I think it's too soon to say. If you look at what's been coming out, my reading of what's coming out with the Gulf countries, look at what's happened. There's definitely back channels which have opened an air corridor, which is getting the flights out. I mean, that doesn't happen without Iranian support. Clearly, they've deconflicted how to get those planes out. You've also had the president of Iran, who's a bit of he's a titular head, doesn't have the power, but saying, he apologizes for the strikes. And then immediately Trump comes out after that and says, there is no end to this war. This is, I will not accept any kind of negotiation. Why does he do that? Again, I think we were moving towards a situation where Gulf countries, you've got to remember, the Saudi had basically normalized relationships with Iran recently. There were joint military exercises, There was a move amongst some of those nations to try to do that. So my sense is they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. One, they've been attacked, We've seen numerous different releases by more junior Gulf officials basically voicing their, heavy opposition to Trump's decision to go to war and the Israeli decision, but nothing at the senior level. And so my sense is, and again, I would look at, if you want to know how this conflict is going to go, watch the GCC, see if they start to come out at the senior leader saying this has to end, that would be one indicator I would look for. But I think so I think they're walking a tightrope essentially between on the one hand sort of wanting and obviously having the bases there, and they have those bases potentially. While they had the THAADs working, were a useful force multiplier for their own Patriot and etc. batteries. I mean, there's going to be some reassessment about that now, isn't there? Because they've been attacked too. So yeah, I think we'll just have to watch the space on that. I think it's emerging. I don't think there's a defined position yet, and a lot of it depends on what actually happens to Iran and how it comes out of this. Of course, if it was heavily defeated and a new more pro-Gulf, more moderate, which I don't see happening really, but leadership was in there, they'd be happier with that than the situation before. But so I think basically it's contingent, it's on the hoof, it's taken them by surprise, and they are conflicted.
Iran elected a new supreme leader yesterday. Are we in a situation where Israel is just going to assassinate them again, and are we going to keep grinding through leadership until we actually get to maybe somebody Trump is happy with, or is he just going to lose interest eventually and whoever's there is going to stay in charge? How do you see that playing out?
It's not as simple as that, and I think this guy, and I'm not an expert on the internal dynamics of Iran, to be honest with you, the intra-regime politics, but he seems to be, less moderate than his father, is from my reading of it. Wow. There'll be obviously cost-benefit analysis of the best way to continue, and that will be shaped by the military situation too. So, but I think the idea that they're just, yes, Israel came straight out and said we're going to kill the next guys. They're basically just saying this is unrelenting. We'll keep going until. You've got to remember there's a lot of sunk costs here now too. So, Hezbollah has been reactivated, so it's a two-front war for Israel again. The US have taken casualties. They've taken major hit to some of their military infrastructure in the Gulf. The Gulf allies are kind of, as I mentioned, a bit like, oh, what's all this about? Not sure about it. And so, and they had this, as we mentioned, they had this window of opportunity, strategically weak, internally weak, had all the leadership together. So I don't see why, and this is what Trump's saying, I don't see why in your position, you're already in now, you may as well keep going and try and just set this regime back militarily and in terms of the nuclear program and the whole military supply system behind the ballistic missiles and behind the drones, just set it back as far as you can. I don't see why you would stop now, really, if you're Trump, because you've taken the cost. Now, one of the things, of course, is pressure from the GCC and the leverage they could bring. And the other one is, of course, the oil price, which is related to that. And I think it's quite interesting that we saw some pretty minor drone strikes which obviously indicated the Iranian ability to get in. Drone strikes on GCC gas and oil infrastructure, followed quite quickly by full closures of these plants. And we don't know. Of course, it's risky to continue production, etc., like that. But it certainly increases the leverage on Trump too if you shut those. And of course the Strait of Hormuz, which we haven't talked about as well, but the complete drop off in shipping going through there, which, you know, I think we're at oil at $100 a barrel now. It's the biggest rise in a few years. But people are saying that the backup, and again, not really my area of expertise, but the shock here is going to be the real shock, and the lag of it is coming. Yeah, and it's very, very significant. You know, some people are saying as significant as the closure of the Suez Canal in 56, for example. So that would be an area of, although the US is fairly energy independent, you'd see the global outcry rise against this.
Do you think Iran actually has the capacity to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed?
It doesn't really matter, and this is the thing, you know, you talk to guys, and I used to work for a company that actually set it's called the war committee, if I remember correctly, you know. They set the risk levels for Lloyd's insurance. Lloyd's are the biggest maritime insurers in the world. It's when the insurers close the straits. Yeah. I mean, they close the straits in relation to risk, but when they say, well, that's it, you know, force majeure, we're not covering this. But the risk is there. Obviously, we've seen things burning in the strait. The idea that the US could run a kind of convoy with a air defense bubble over it is okay. Very expensive for the US. Still quite risky for insurers. You know, you're trying to work out, well, what's the chances? I mean, so far, I'd say, given the performance of the US Navy in that area, and we haven't had a full strike on a Navy vessel, it's probably pretty good. But you burn through your weapons pretty quickly, depending on the rate, you know. So, but what I can say is that the clamour for this is going to increase in the next few weeks. If we come back and talk about this next week, I'd say the situation in terms of the global economy is going to be quite different.
What framework should we be looking at this conflict through? Is it a regional war? Should we look at it as like a Cold War between the US and China, perhaps, or is it something that could grow into maybe like a broader than a regional conflict, or potentially towards a global conflict? How do you view it in terms of framework here? And obviously you have Israel as well, which complicates it, because they obviously have very regional interests in actually winning this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, this is the analogy I kind of use. If you look at previous world wars, they broke out as regional wars between powers that wanted to upend the status quo. So basically, World War II, if anyone needs to remind, you know, was Germany going throwing its weight around in Europe again with expansionist policies. The Italians doing, well, this is it. The Italians doing it in Europe. So that's what it started, and then Japan going, you know, a couple of years or whatever it was, a couple of years later, and that is what turned it into a conflagration. So I think if you look at the situation now, unfortunately, and you know, some of it depends on how long this war lasts, of course. But if the war in Iran burns on, we have a situation where meeting two of the three wider global conflict situations that are moving us towards World War III. You have a long-term and sustained war in Ukraine, which affects Europe. You now have one in the Middle East, if this continues, depending on how long. And the last one, and this is the thing that Iran may affect the calculus is, you know, as I mentioned, there's reports now that they've had to move these, again, one of these THAAD high-end missile defense systems in South Korea has been moved to the Middle East. And the Chinese must be thinking this in the same way that the Israelis and the US were thinking we have a window of opportunity. The Chinese must be thinking about this in Taiwan. Now, whether they're ready or not, we don't know. The interesting thing about what this is showing is that sometimes you're not ready. You know, opportunities present themselves, and there's a difference between readiness and opportunity.
Do you think America is like clearing the deck of these kind of smaller troublemakers like Venezuela and Iran in preparation for perhaps China and dealing with Ukraine, Russia? And do you think the Chinese has any reason to fear, perhaps, from what they've seen by America and I guess Israel as well?
Yeah, I think the US is clearly trying to establish itself, its back garden, essentially. So the Venezuela piece, the Cuba piece, the counter-cartels initiative, announced a couple of days ago, very clearly seeing itself as it's the Don Roe doctrine. Get the Americas in order. Greenland is a part of that too. I'm not saying I excuse that, but it explains it. Their thinking. Iran, it has a part in that strategic thing, especially if you end up with a situation, ideally for the Americans, where they can control the output from southern Iran and the flows of oil to China. That's a kind of handy leverage to have. It's not completely critical to China's energy, but it's, as I mentioned, 10 to 15%. So, but on the other hand, China's going to be looking at this and going, look, the Americans are burning through their stockpiles of munitions and they're distracted over there. But it's very hard to say. Everyone's called it. My sense is China would rather take Taiwan if it can without force, just the Chinese way of conflict to date. And let's look to what the elections are. I think is it a couple of years in Taiwan, because that could, if the more pro-China party gets in, that might hold them off. Whereas if not, we could see the cues for something coming on. We just have to wait and see. I think as I mentioned though, there is an opportunity for them right now strategically.
In terms of like munitions and the capacity to actually replenish them, and as well intelligence, if the US is occupied in the Middle East, they can't supply as much intelligence to Ukraine in the Russian conflict. So is this going to degrade Ukraine and perhaps actually encourage Russia for the offensive in the spring and the summer as well?
One of the really interesting things about this is the Russian economy was tanking because of the price of oil being low, and this has put it way up. And so it's moved it overnight from a situation where things were not looking good and starting to really bite to, we can sustain this more. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, of course, the air defense that Kiev needs to defend itself. I mean, the chance of resupply now for those Patriots, pretty low, I would have thought. Now, look, on the other hand, Zelensky has said he's sending counter-drone expertise and systems out to the Gulf. So, maybe there's a quid pro quo there. And certainly what's emerging, I think, in the Gulf is, first of all, and the US's lack of expertise and capacity to deal with the amount of drones. So as the war goes on, maybe the drone element will become more important, and potentially there's some deal there that can be struck with the Gulf countries to give them some Patriots. But it's no coincidence that Russia launched one of its biggest ballistic missile attacks on Ukraine in a while over the last, I think it was in the 6th to the 7th, overnight. So it's going to have an impact, yeah, and it's not great for Ukraine, but there's still some points of leverage.
Yeah, I wonder if like some people would argue that Trump is very willing to take on these more regional, non-nuclear powers, but less willing to stand up to Putin. Do you see any stock in that argument?
Well, that is an interesting question, and a threat of getting sued. Yeah, maybe, but just leave that one there.
That's fair. Now, in terms of the US, I guess it's hard to say, but the US doesn't have the industrial capacity that it used to have. But do you think it still has the ability to actually do this sustained war? Obviously China is a massive industrial power, and if drone warfare is becoming more important, can the US actually sustain that output if there is a great power conflict, which is obviously possible between China and the US, or the US does intervene on the behalf of Taiwan even to arm them?
Well, they are arming them. I mean, and the Taiwanese are placing large orders. I mean, the question then is how quickly those orders come through, which ties to your defense industrial thing. Again, the US, I mean, one area China's getting dominance now is just in the naval domain. They're producing so much in that area. If you look at the new national security strategy for the US, it doesn't really mention commitment to Taiwan anymore, which is very interesting, and an indicator of it. And I'm not convinced the US. I think the US is moving. This administration is moving away from an idea that it has to defend Taiwan. Where it gets more complex is if there's a regional war quite quick. Yes, so China goes, North Korea go against South Korea, Japan feels it must defend Taiwan. That has the kind of what we call the chain gang effect for the US of God. We've got to move in with these allies because it's use it or lose it. That's kind of and again similar to dynamics that we saw at the start of the Second World War. Alliances and even the First World War pulling them in. In terms of the defense capacity vis-a-vis, like say on drones, I think what it is you're going to have they're moving fast to try to fix this in the US, but they are a bit behind, say, where the forward edge of where the battle is, and the people at the front of that are the Ukrainians. And I think companies that, the Ukrainians, startups, etc., and they're fusing with some British tech companies, etc., are going to be at the forefront of the bids that are the most probable to win and get incorporated into America's defense, industrial plans. But I mean, it's a very different subset of problems, military problems, in a Chinese invasion of Iran. It's Taiwan. It's amphibious. And it's a naval crossing. I'm sure obviously drones will be a very important part, but there's a very heavy physical part if they decide to go the military route. Of course, there's numerous other options for just kind of blockading and slowly strangling off and creating the conditions where potentially there's less resistance inside Taiwan too.
And as you mentioned earlier, if the pro-China party, the KMT, if they're in government, there might be less need for conflict to take over Taiwan. It could be gradual, like in the case of Hong Kong as well. Now, in terms of AI, so some people have speculated, I'm not sure if there's concrete evidence, that the US used Claude models maybe to plan or to gather data for the Venezuela operation as well in the Middle East. So are we going to see AI increasingly used in warfare to I guess, collate and aggregate all this data and for planning as well?
Well, it already is. Having been an officer, the amount of time it used to take to develop a kind of set of orders, and then the flippant situation changes and you're like, well, what a waste of time. And like people would say, yeah, well, it's the process, not the actual plan. But, this tempo is important. That's basically, initiative is based on tempo. Tempo is your ability to react vis-a-vis the enemies and impose, your will on them and then force them to react. And then you're inside there, the OODA loop: observe, orientate, decide, act. And then guess what? You generate faster than them. They're still reacting. So if you've got AI doing a lot of your staff work, and apparently, I've heard, people their mind boggles. Like staff officers are just like, oh my God, this has just done what would have taken me a day to do. And it's just boom, there's the output. So that's already happening, and it can give you different courses of action, some probabilities, etc. So that's already happening. So the fact that it was used, in terms of an analysis piece, and helping planning and queuing decisions, it's just that's happening, and it's been happening for a good while. So yeah, the Maduro. Now, where it gets more, then what can it do in real time analysis? So if you need to change your plan, yeah, I think we're moving. There's definitely elements of that. And then the final one is about targeting, and this is goes to Hegseth falling out with Anthropic. And then Palantir stepping in, etc. And of course the idea that you need a human in a loop in terms of targeting and whether you were going to decentralize and decision making to autonomous or AI systems and the targeting piece. And I mean, some people are deeply uncomfortable with that. The problem is the regimes that we potentially are going to end up, or the US are going to end up fighting, seem to have less constraints about that. Another interesting example is, for example, they're starting to see UGVs, ground vehicles, unmanned ground vehicles, with a heavy machine gun, a small tank, a sensor based, being used extensively by the Ukrainians and to some degree by the Russians, to hold positions, to move forward, etc. But they still have, they would have the ability not to, or to be fully autonomous, but the Ukrainians at least still have a human making the decision about when to fire or not.
Have you seen those videos with the Chinese military demoing those like robot dogs? They're very strange looking, but they seem to actually train with them.
I haven't seen that, no, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff coming out, kind of high tech, looking very capable Chinese, small unit tactics, for example. But it's untested yet, and that's the big question. It's who knows? I mean, there'll be a sharp if China decide to do anything, there'll be a sharp learning curve. You would have thought that they're ready for that, because they'll realize this is pretty much a vulnerability. We're not really tested as a military. We're getting lessons learned back from, and of course, probably observers working out what's going on in Ukraine, of course, and hearing stuff coming back from the North Koreans, etc. So, but yeah, that's always one big question mark, is like sort of suggested capability versus real capability.
That's a good point, definitely. Because again, they haven't been the Chinese army hasn't been in a war since probably, was it 1979, Vietnam, I think?
Vietnam, yeah.
Yeah, so again, we don't know how that's going to play out. So a lot of people talk about how Trump is, I guess, destroying the international order. But then again, as a counterpoint, that it was perhaps decaying anyway, and the international order wasn't able to control Putin. So how do you view Trump's willingness to act outside international law and even outside Congress and actually initiate these operations?
So, I mean, his obviously it comes down to being transactional. He's sitting there, he says repeatedly, NATO was a bad deal for the United States. He had a point. He's right. NATO, had lived off cheap Russian, or European states had lived off cheap Russian energy and cheap US security, and those days are over, and he's ended them. All he did is draw a line under it faster and more in a more forthright fashion than the previous US presidents, who'd been saying it for a long time but being more diplomatic about it. And it's all driven by a decline in the relative power of the United States. So that's the strategic driver vis-a-vis China and other states, and it can't afford to do it anymore. And therefore, cleaning up your backyard in a transactional state, again, you're looking at, like what he says, the Chinese flooding the southern borders with fentanyl, using immigration as a weapon. It all ties in with this idea that we're not as strong as we once were, and we can't let these kind of death by 1,000 cut strategies happen anymore and continue. In one way, your question is really good in terms of goes to the nub of it. Like, how much was the old order a bit on life support anyway, and how much is he just ripping it to shreds too? Is a very, very good question. I don't think he's in total. I think he's fairly smart and kind of like assessing the situation, but I think he doesn't massively, from my understand, plan. He's not a chess player, really.
He's not detail oriented either.
Well, yeah, exactly, and exactly. So it's kind of like he'll weigh things up in the moment and have a go at something, and then see what the reaction is, and either respond, and work out his response. He's not so much, it seems to me, a chess player, and that's important when other adversaries are playing chess with you. And some of his strengths is people don't know what he's going to do. It's a bit of a wild card. He talks tough. He does act tough, sometimes. So
it's a bit of a madman strategy.
Well, he's definitely riffing off that, the old Nixon thing.
What's the importance of the EU here? So, like, the EU is obviously this bureaucracy which doesn't, like, its economy grows 1% a year. It doesn't really have, like, its defence capacity is limited. It doesn't really produce on that level like America. So is the EU kicking into gear? I know some countries are, like Finland, obviously, because of the proximity to Russia. Is the EU going to successfully rearm like countries like Germany? And how is that going to go? Are they going to become an important player?
Well, I mean, Germany are moving from a low base, but they're moving fast and with coordination as the Germans can. So watch this space. Poland, stuff that just doesn't even make the news yesterday or over last week because of Iran. France, Germany and Poland have started the kind of process for sharing nuclear weapons technology. So, that will take a while. They've got a steering group, you can say that, but I think the direction of travel is for these states to at least have access to the technology and know-how behind which sustains France's nuclear. Some of it which sustains their nuclear deterrence. France and the UK have announced a kind of joint joint mechanism in terms of their nuclear deterrence and cooperation too. So the EU's role really is to stump up cash, isn't it, with the European Defence Fund to generate more defence industrial base. But it's, again, coming from a low base, need to increase. There's been some good stories in terms of increasing artillery production, etc. But its major role really is, I would say, not really to get sucked into what's going on in Iran or indeed with China and Taiwan. If something happens there, it's to remain laser focused on its own security and that of Ukraine and the situation to the east as much as possible.
How do you view Ireland in all of this? So obviously Ireland isn't in NATO, but it does, I guess, it does kind of fall under the American umbrella. If it can't depend on America, does it have to consider maybe building up its own defence capacity a bit more? Because again, we've less than 9,000 in the armed forces, and it's not, we obviously don't spend enough on it, and this has been pointed out.
Look, I'm a big fan of Irish neutrality. I grew up with that. I know how it's taught at home in schools. I agree with it. I think it's a principled decision. Unfortunately, what happened, post the crash in Ireland, we went, I nearly joined the Irish cadets, and it was seen professionally as, really, really good career, but also really well respected in terms of his peacekeeping and his competence. What's happened since then is just chronic underinvestment to the point where it's lost coherence. And it's coming from such a low base. We saw the Commission deliver the outcomes of, did we want level of ambition 3, 2 or 1? It chose 2, of course, which was a setup really. But you're at the assumptions check here where the situation is changing, and you probably need to go to level of ambition 3, I would have thought, just to protect the people. The thing about neutrality is, in international law, and you don't have to join NATO or anything like that. You need to be able to protect your air and your space, at least credibly, as some sort of credible deterrence.
Is neutrality anything beyond like rhetoric or a verbal commitment there? If we actually genuinely don't have the capacity to defend ourselves, we can't police our skies.
No, and we've seen the UK and the France, between the air agreement with the UK and the naval exercises off the naval responses by the UK and France to Russian incursions. Of course, it all ties in with a stretching strategy by the Russians trying to pull assets and resources all over the place. Look, there's some movement in the right direction. You can see in terms of getting aircraft in, installing radars, etc. It's happening fairly slowly. They've got the increased spending now. Looking at going through I think it's interesting we're going with France, seems to be the provider of choice. I think that's strategic in terms of its EU. It's not the UK, so it doesn't have that optic, which can be problematic for some of the population. And the UK is Brexited too, so it's not EU anymore. So I'd watch that space. But my sense is, we're coming from such a low base. You've got two strategic decisions here, really. Like one is like, start to invest pretty heavily to get ourselves up to a decent size. What you're looking at is look at Austria. Yeah, they're neutral. They spend 3% of GDP on their defence, and they're increasing rapidly. Switzerland, look at how Switzerland is totally neutral and has always been neutral, has a capable air force and military, and has a system in place, and I'm not saying we go down this route, but has a civic resilience and reserve system in place, and of course it's got a geography that helps. Just saying we're neutral is not a defence anymore. You can try and hide, you can put your head down here and go, we're incapable, like the turtle, we're incapable of doing anything, please don't do anything to us. Doesn't necessarily mean when it all
this
kicks
day and
off,
age as well,
you
you obviously have like cyber warfare and cognitive warfare, which we are also very vulnerable to. Like it doesn't have to be.
That's it. Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, exactly. And of course, if something kicks off and there's a decision about whether you join an alliance against, for example, Russia or not, which I don't think we would, but like in the UK, more example, you're going to see this contested very heavily in social media, etc. Of course.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining.
Cheers, Donald.